Welcome to the Listen to This Bull live show. My name is Matt Mulholland. That's Adam Scott. He's going to be joining us for the hell of it, because otherwise it'd be all by myself all day long. We had some cancellations today, so if you expected a show about a specific topic, too bad. We get to talk about whatever we want today instead. In fact, if you are watching this live, you also get to talk about whatever you want. You can even help drive the conversation. So put some stuff in the commentary, and we can go down those interesting paths. Hell, if you have a question about an insurance claim, we'd be happy to answer those for you. Adam, you've got, what, a year or so as a PA now?
Yeah, so I switched over from IA side to PA last year in May.
So we could get some of the other side's mentality to go along with it, because he hasn't completely expunged the Kool-Aid from his system just yet. So let me hit this button and we'll get started. Well, I just read your text that you don't have any beer. That's a shame. I'll just have to drink twice as much.
Please do. Yeah. I'm in the office, so we don't typically stock the cooler here with beer.
No. Adam, you were on the carrier side. You're doing a lot of appraisals and a little bit of PA work now. Out of curiosity, 1 year as a PA, what do you think is the most important thing you've learned so far?
That overall, I'd say overall, there's just it's a difference in training and ethics. And if those two roads can sort of come to a cross, the industry as a whole would be better off, and people would get handled correctly faster.
What do you mean by ethics in that?
Well, so when a person buys a policy, right, they go to their sales agent, and that sales agent has to pass an exam to get their license to be a salesperson. So they have to understand different parts of the policy. Once they start selling that policy, the only thing that they really have to do when they're selling the policy is sell the general policy, the idea of the policy, and the declarations page. So very few times, if ever, do you get to see a full policy as a purchaser, as an insured, before there's a catastrophe, before there's a pipe leak. So there's very little time for somebody to understand what their policy does or does not include. And the way some of those things are written as endorsements sound like they're going to include things when they're typically exclusions, like screen enclosure endorsements are a big one. On the IA side, I find myself having to explain that to people quite often, that they have a screen enclosure endorsement that is an exclusion of that screen enclosure. And me being the IA or the senior adjuster coming out to fix it, or the appraiser, it's the bad news you get to deliver.
Yeah, you get to be the bad guy instead of the agent that sold them the policy, or the insurance company that built the website that they went through some checklists on and didn't know. Yeah, no, it's crazy. Actually, well, I purchased a policy for a house that I bought about 3 years ago, and I went through, it was Universal, the big elephant. I went through and I put everything in there. I know what I want. I wanted ordinance and law. I wanted a little bit higher in RCV benefits on my personal property. I knew what I wanted. I didn't have any other structures other than the driveway. And I got my policy, and it asked me some very specific questions that I actually didn't know the answer to, and I should have. But it asked if my house was stick built or if it was cement block, and it was actually a mix. So I didn't know what I should put in there. Should I call it stick built when the foundation, which makes up quite a large portion of this, is concrete block? In reality, and there's this big basement inside the concrete block foundation. So it technically would be stick built, but I had actually looked that up because it was confusing to me. But if I had gotten that wrong, they might have said that I misrepresented how my house was built. And then I had to know how far from my house the fire hydrant was, because all of us know exactly how far that is. right?
Right.
So I literally went for a walk looking for a friggin' fire hydrant and counting my steps. Luckily, I didn't have to go far. There was one really, really close. So that worked out. But I got to the point where it asked me for my history in claims. And so I had to have my claim history report because I did have a few claims in the past where a tree had fallen on a previous property and other things and a pipe burst situation. But if I didn't know that information, I might have put something else in there. When I got my deck page, it had everything in there that I could, I knew what I had just clicked through. I knew what I had ordered. I didn't bother looking at the rest of it. I knew what I had. And then I had a claim. I had a pipe burst behind a shower. And I learned that I actually purchased an HO8 policy when I thought I was getting an HO3. I should have looked at the deck page a little closer maybe and realized that the policy that I was sold was a named peril policy. Pipe burst was not one of the named perils.
Yeah.
So
and it's one of those things where when somebody's purchasing it, especially with the rate increases that we're seeing this year, people are going to be looking for lowest cost options. So they're going to be shopping online, and there's no requirement that I'm aware of in any state where you have to give a full copy of the policy to the policyholder, and most won't sell you the policy in its entirety. You won't get to read it in its entirety before you sign off on.
You don't get to see it. You don't get to read it. If it's the same policy that they're selling to everybody in that state, it should be something that's right there on their website. Anyone could peruse it. That would be great. Why don't they do that, though? I don't know why they don't do that.
Ease of sales, maybe lack of training.
That's
maybe,
why.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't have a good answer for that, but I ran into it on the IA side constantly, where I'm having to re-explain what these people have bought and try and mitigate that damage that's not the damage that I'm there for in the first place. So
I mean, the only thing that they're told is they're purchasing an RCB policy as if every RCB policy is the same. And that's what is assumed by a lot of people. Here's an RCB policy for my house. Here's an RCB policy for my house. This one costs $1,000 a year less. I'm going to buy that one. They're both RCB policies. I should be getting roughly the same thing, but this one's cheaper. They don't know.
Those things, the ACV, the roof schedule endorsement that they've got on a lot of these, need to be very detailed and explained. When somebody's got a roof that's 14, 15 years old, and it says in their policy that they're going to apply every single part of it, including O&P, or every single part of that roof structure is going to be depreciated down by a percentage based on year. I first ran into that in Louisiana and saw it down here in Florida, and we had a roof that was 16 years old. So it went from
we've had it in Georgia for quite a time. Georgia was probably 2017 when I first started seeing it. It feels like they were actually trying it out in certain states, and Georgia might have been one of those states. But there's also the ACV only after a certain year or age of a roof. That was built into policies for many years, going back as far as 2015 that I can remember first in Georgia. I live in Florida now, but and the policies aren't as bad here, but they're bad in other ways. They get into other aspects with the lack of wind coverages and things. But it does kind of blow my mind. If you're going to purchase an insurance policy, you should be able to read what it is. But to be fair, when they do send us information, we don't read it. So they could give us everything that we're asking for. We probably would just throw it away anyway.
It's like the end user license agreement. You just click through, but it's dry stuff. But that's the important stuff that's going to come back to bite you in the ass. So,
I mean, that's what it is. So even if we got what we were asking for, I don't know if it would make much difference. It's still better than not getting it, I think. But there's a lot of that stuff that
I feel when the person writing the policy sees that you've got a screen enclosure and they try and sell you on a screen enclosure endorsement, that's a problem. Or when you've got specific items on your house, or they're missing other structures or contents completely. When they sell you a policy that doesn't have any of these things, and it's very easy to screenshot or Google or pull up a Zillow on the person's stuff and say, hey, look, I'm supposed to be your agent, have you in your best interest at heart. notice this thing about your previous files. Notice this thing about your house from a street view or whatever. But that's an extra step, and they're busy. But that's
I got a recommendation for the insurance carriers that are watching this. If you want to be known as a very transparent carrier that definitely actually wants to take care of their clients, I would recommend on your website you have videos that explain the meaning of each section of your policy and what it's actually saying.
Yeah.
That would be unbelievably helpful.
Game changing.
It would be. No one does that. Not a single insurance carrier out there has that. So if you were the first one to have it, I would drive everybody to your company.
That'd be great. I'd love to see that.
What's up, Hank?
Hank, yes, sir.
So we don't have any topics today at all. You just happen to be a fairly new PA coming from the other side. So I was going to ask you a bunch of questions, but honestly, I would love for the audience to drive this. What do you guys want to know the most about? What kind of shit should we be talking about? Have you dealt with some bullshit lately that you want some explanation of possibly? Adam, have you dealt with some bullshit lately?
Yeah, I'd say so. So I've got, in Florida, I've got a condo claim, and it's not anything to do with the hurricane claim. There's a water claim where the upstairs tenant water burst, and we've gone into determining who's responsible for what. Which on a condo claim, as a PA or an IA, condo claims are great. When if you're an IA, you get to go out there and write it, and you know you're going to be there a while. PA, same thing. You're looking at it for a long-term benefit. It's a lot of work up front, but it can be a big payout. On individual condo claims, we've got one where the insured is just at a loss. We hired in the right professionals at the PA, got them taken care of, and we thought we had them taken care of. Mitigation team came in. The first mitigation team did nothing. Mold came through. They had an endorsement. We went beyond that and got out some really good people to come out and do an environmental protocol, wrote that up. The ServPro that was in the local area followed the protocol to a T. And then we're running into, some of these auditing companies that are going back through and double checking things. We submitted our estimate on a claim 90 days ago, coming up on 90 days since we met with the IA on site. They offered us a $12,000 release for the full claim.
They offer you a release on the first offer?
Yeah, they came back with a first offer, said $12,000 release. And because the IA was an excellent IA, I called him about it. I'm like, you're out of your mind. He's like, oh, no, they haven't even asked me for the estimate yet. So they had offered a full release prior to seeing the IA's estimate. And their release was somewhere in the range of like a third, 30% of what it was. And it didn't include coverage B or ALE. And they may not want them to write.
What the hell is that about? I've never heard that happening before.
No, me neither. And on an IA side, I was shocked that it took them that long to get the file in. But I've got their timeline, and that's what I like about it. On the IA side, I was always super transparent. Here's how long I have to write a file and turn it in. And on the appraisal and umpire side, I worked the same basic schedule, 48, 72 hours. But when they offer a release prior to even seeing the estimate, and then they get the estimate, and then they have a third party re-audit that estimate from an IA, I've never seen that. I've seen desk adjusters. I've seen quality control, but I've never seen another outside auditor for an IA claim. So
that's
that's
really surprising. That doesn't really even compute. I can't understand. If anybody else out there has had that situation, please let us know. Are you comfortable telling us who the insurance company is that did that?
No, because it's still an open claim.
Yeah.
But I want to keep. That's why I'm just keeping the parties out of it. But that's the situation I'm in, where it's an open claim. And what do you do? At what point?
I really need to know if this is a one-off situation, if this is just something that went surprisingly wrong, or maybe there's
I don't think so. We
I
submitted
can't think of
solid
anything that would
documentation.
drive a carrier to want to do that
Mm-mm.
unless they think they can just get. When was the loss?
11. It was November 11th.
So it's still
So
been a long ass time. When did you
should be
get
long.
that release?
Well, they haven't sent it because we rejected it, and we submitted back a counteroffer.
When was their
Um,
first offer?
Their first offer was, let's see, it was May 23rd. May 23rd was their first offer. Once we had all the proof of loss and everything back in, we submitted a proof of loss pretty early, which is how we got to the IA in March.
Their first offer, it wasn't even them acknowledging coverages or anything. Their first time that they acknowledged coverage or gave any kind of an indication was in May, 6 months plus some days after the loss.
our proof of loss. Like their original offer was like $3,000 for these people to get their home fixed. There's a mitigation company came out and did something. It didn't exactly work. We found that they had pretty extensive water damage and mold, had mold coverage. And then it was a back and forth between being a condo claim, who's responsible for what? Is the, if it's the sheetrock, we were unable to get the condo association to get involved because they didn't want to touch it. They said, we're not responsible for that. It's the upstairs neighbor that's responsible for it. So I went back through their bylaws, highlighted the bylaws, had another attorney go back and make sure that I'm not just being a jackhole, and say, hey, these are the provisions. You guys are responsible for these, but subrogation can happen. We can go back and subrogate against it. But the management company didn't want it. And I'm pretty sure the reason that this went down this way is because it's a single unit claim and they don't want to pay the deductible. So they're going to force these people into subrogating against their upstairs neighbor, which is also part of the policy or also part of their HOA guidelines, bylaws. But now these people have been out of their home.
To subrogate. They do the subrogation for you. You're not. That's so freaking weird, though, man. Clearly, there's been way too much time in between the investigation of the claim and making a coverage decision, and maybe that's why they sent that out so that they wouldn't have any potential bad faith. It still happened before when does the new law go into place? Is it January 1st then? So the loss happened before the new law, so there could still be potential bad faith funds for the attorney's fees and other things. I can't think of any other reason why they would attempt to do that kind of a thing. If anybody else has had this issue, though, I really want to know if this is a systemic problem, if they're going down that route. That's crazy.
I've never seen it. And, when I get something from an IA and the IA tells me, hey, I've just been put as the desk adjuster says, hey, I've just been thrown into this because the other person's gone. I'm like, well, catch up. You've got all the documentation in the world. This should be pretty cut and dry. And then it just wasn't handled for another 6 weeks after that. So we're coming up on 90 days from their IA coming out.
That's
and we still receive no.
These time frames are very strict. There are other states where the time frame is more of a reasonability thing. Holy crap!
Yeah, so
right,
we're looking into
Stephen, Mr. Hazi. Executive seems to base their pricing on the labor yield from male workers. Male is in not female, for those of you listening to this. There is an all-female roofing crew for which an insurer has denied their increased cost to perform the work because they are female and cannot carry as much weight at one time. Should pricing be based off of only male workers? Huh. I have to read this again. There is an all-female roofing crew for which an insurer has denied their increased cost to perform the work because they are all female, cannot carry as much weight at a time. So the female crew has the increased cost, and they're saying it's because they're females and it's going to take them longer. So their labor rates are higher than a male crew's. So the female roofing crew is charging more. And should the pricing be based off of only male workers, or at least the average, I guess, worker, would be an interesting question. I kind of see two angles on this.
I'm with you. I
think
I'm right there.
I'm going to leave that up. There's so an insurance company owes to pay the amount that's reasonable and necessary to repair or replace the damaged property. Right? So if it is reasonable to expect, even, I don't even want to say it out loud. That's how unreasonable it is, actually. Is it reasonable to expect male workers to do the job? That's probably sexist as hell.
I see 2 points of it. As if it's a general labor code, if the person doing the job, are they able to perform their function as a roofer? What are the expectations?
They're not able to do it. Is their function requiring a certain amount of time to have it done?
Right.
If someone chooses to hire an all-female working crew for a higher price, and it's higher than the average or normal price, then the insurance company might be able to say that, no, that isn't necessary. If they're the only choice in the area and their labor is higher, then it would be necessary. Reasonable versus necessary are two very different things. Is it necessary to hire an all-female crew? No. What kind of a person actually asks if the crews are all male or female? This is such a weird thing. So Xactimate itself, though, very customizable. I had Andrew Behrens on here the other day talking about customized pricing lists for Xactimate that you can purchase from him to be able to get pricing specifically for your company built into your line items automatically, and a new price list come out with your specifications that you can put in your own material costs and things like that. Material costs apparently are usually pretty close, but man, that is an interesting thing. And then Stephen goes on to say, of course, he had to make this as politically correct as possible. Yeah. This could also apply to gay people as well.
I don't want to go with that one because I can definitely be outlifted.
So I don't know if gay people are typically weaker than non-gay people of the same sex.
I don't see how the second comment applies, but all right, Stephen.
Yeah. All right.
Like the one for male versus female, I understand the question. I think general roofing labor codes are kind of there. Now I would say use the proper roofer code versus use the proper labor code for what you're doing, and I think that equals out. I think the male versus female would be tough to see in settlement. I think you're going to end up having to see a case law or something about it. But yeah. I think you're right on with what's reasonable and what's required.
I mean, the whole appraisal provision is designed to keep people from gouging them, right? So would it be almost considered a gouging practice to increase labor costs for a reason that could be considered avoidable? I'm not opposed to hiring all female crews. And to be honest, the female crews that I'm aware of, at least, are better than a lot of the male crews that I've seen, at least in their work product. Whether or not they're faster, I don't know. So he goes on to ask, would it be legal for contractors to give an estimate for work at a certain discounted price, such as Xactimate pricing, in exchange for prompt payment? And then by contrast, state that if payment is not made within that time period, the cost increases to a much higher rate, such as including overhead and profit or something. Well, let me say this. I'm not a lawyer. Adam, are you a lawyer?
Not a bit.
So we can speculate on whether it's legal, but we don't know for sure. You should ask a lawyer that question, but I don't think so. I don't think it would be illegal. I think it would be legal. Plenty of companies do that.
I think it'd be better off to say that if it's, if whatever the price is, it's not paid, that there could potentially be penalties or late charges or interest, but I don't know.
It ends up being the same thing. So, I mean, you could dress it up how you want, but ultimately it's the same thing as what Adam just said. At a certain date, our cost is higher. Or it's like adding interest to the payment almost. So you could just basically make it very specific to do it this way. I have known contractors that have done this actually, that would put in there that if their estimate was accepted and payment provided, they would give a 10% discount for payments made within the first 30 days after the thing. And beyond that, the discount disappeared. And a lot of times, supposedly, now this was a contractor talking, and you know how they are with the all day sun and crap like that. It's not really that it happens all the time, but he said that the carriers accept that amount, that 10% discount, and pay the thing all the time. So probably like 1 in 10, maybe, if I had to guess, based on my experience with certain contractors. Not saying that guy specifically. I'm going to go back up to a different question that was here. Super Dave. Super Dave is a big fan that's been on the show or been commenting on the show for a while now. Big Red said plank decking is not space decking. Okay, so plank decking can be spaced decking, but it isn't necessarily spaced decking. It's just that it's made of lumber instead of sheet goods. All right? So you can have solidly sheathed plank deck where the decking is butted up to each other all the way up, and it's lumber, I mean like 2x4s, one bys mostly. I don't know why I said 2x4s. Ignore that I said 2x4s. 1x going up, 1x6s, things like that. It has to be a minimum of 6 inches wide. So 1x6 going up. It might not be spaced decking. What most contractors claim is spaced decking is decking that has gaps of 1/4 inch or larger. For some shingle manufacturers, they only allow gaps of 1/8 inch or smaller. And a lot of them, it's 1/4 inch or smaller. And that's so you don't put a nail through a shingle and end up hitting that gap. The nail hits nothing. So it would void wind warranties. But they call that spaced decking. And that's not the right term for it. Spaced decking is purposeful spaces where they put a couple inch gaps in between these things, 1.5 inches, in order to allow airflow through the decking to the backside of the shingle. So they'll do this in old shake applications that have interlayment type things, or they might even have it on old tile or slate applications where they might have some large 6-inch gaps. That's spaced decking. It's literally putting a space in between it on purpose. They also call it skip decking. So Big Red might not be wrong. Anything to add to that, Adam?
No, I agree with that. When's the last time you've seen space decking on an installation that wasn't
actual space decking? Actually, I see it fairly often. And a lot of times they'll go back with shingles on there without correcting it. And then there's slide out and all kinds of shit like that. Big gaps I see all the time. Lumber does shrink, it warps. There's going to be gaps. Well, we could talk about what it's owed for in those situations.
I had a
lot of other questions.
So I had a roof that had a tree fall on it, and the plank decking that was up there was not space decking. It was just plank decking. But when we got into it and started going into the attic, well, I mean, you could see the attic from the ground because the tree fell through it. We started to realize that they had 1x4s, 1x6, and just the measurements were all over the place on this thing. And there's not a uniform roof. The gaps were crazy. So we ended up having to go.
1x4s are acceptable. When you're talking about plywood strips, the plywood has to be a minimum of 6 inches wide. For 1x lumber roofing, it can be 1x4s. It can't be thinner than 1x4. So I misspoke earlier. Anyway, keep going.
Yeah. So we had found that the decking on this thing was entirely just sort of thrown together.
Yeah.
So it became a whole thing with their ordinance and law coverage coming in to get the rest of the roof replaced. I mean, the roof was older and shot anyways, but then it was redecking the entire thing ended up having to be brought in. It's a tree fall where we ended up having to bring an engineer out because the tree fell, hit the CMU block building that was built in the 1960s, and the front left corner where it was hitting the back right of this building, the front left corner, the CMU blocks had shifted. So now we're getting into whether or not those CMU block walls are up to code because they didn't pour those originally with rebar and things in them. So
interesting.
Yeah.
Was it to code when it was built?
Yeah, when it was built, it was. It looks like the roof had been replaced since then.
So you do have a code upgrade scenario then, including rebar. Would they have to replace all of it or just the areas that are broken? That's it.
Yeah.
Rather interesting. I don't know if I've dealt with that particular situation myself.
Yeah, that's
all right. Everybody wanted to comment on the female crew thing. We've got a lot on this. I guess we'll get back into female crews. I think it's just because we have a lot of male viewers and they want to talk about females for a change. Personally, that's what I think. Third party, PJ Smith says, third party audit of IA estimates in Florida is due to the heat publicly. What I almost said was terrible.
I was waiting for it.
Due to the heat publicly that the carriers are facing from the desk adjusters editing the IA estimates and altering them without their knowledge. That might be true. It was where I went first in my head. And this is the comments on what the immediate release for Adam's deal. I thought about that immediately, and that's why I'm wondering if this is something that a lot of carriers are doing, because this would avoid having to say that they're going to pay out less than what the IA paid out. But to comment on that heat that Florida is getting. We had Brianna Sachs on here on the show. She's the one that posted that story from the Washington Post. And we were talking about the changes that were being made. And for whatever reason, the defense counsel guys that are all over LinkedIn are all spouting that this is just BS, that IA firms have the right to change their IA's estimates all they want. And then they completely ignore the fact that photos were deleted, captions were changed, the word damage was removed in a lot of places. This is not just changing estimates. Now, I disagree that they can just change someone's estimate and leave their name on it as if they're the original writer without saying that there were revisions that were made or even changing the name that's on it. But I can almost see them arguing against that not being fraud. But they delete photos, they change the captions that say this is caused by wind damage to not say that so that they can get away with saying a different thing. I'm sorry, that's a problem. I'm gonna
go off on a tangent here on this exact topic. So as an IA, there are companies out there that will, in their internal documents, prohibit you with certain carriers that you're writing for from using the words damage or specifying what the damage is. They won't let you say things like wind damage or hail damage or roof damage. They will stop you.
Now we've heard of this. Yeah. This is the scenario. It's crazy. What is the job of an IA?
Well, do you want the TPA's version or the IA's estimate? Like the IA's,
I guess I want both.
So as an IA, my job is to go out there and do the job that I'm ethically bound to do, which is do my due diligence, read the report, check the policy, inspect the damage, and make sure that it's everything that's supposed to be there, that I'm being careful and methodical with it. And I present all those facts in an organized manner so they can get paid appropriately. The IA firms want you, when you're going out to an insurance claim as an IA, they want you to train as though you're a detective, right? You want to find out what the part is, what part of the water burst, did they retain the part? You really got to dig in. And it's not that you're digging in so you can get them coverage. It's that you're digging in so they don't write too much or that they can potentially find faulty workmanship. So when they're, that's at least the feeling that I got. But when they go in and they prohibit you with specific character or carriers from saying damage, or they will absolutely say in big emails to groups that we cannot say that this is improper installation. And I'm looking at a roof where the shingles on this roof are in curves. I mean, it looks like a Hobbit roof, right? So the shingles are not in line. Some of them are over trimmed. And this is the roof that's up there. And yeah, there was some wind, but even if I was to say that it was improper installation on top of the wind, I don't know that I'd be wrong, but the carrier says you cannot say that. So there's a lot of questionable things that happen on the IA side. So I understand the heat there.
Ooh, we're going to get in the weeds here, and I'm going to ignore a lot of questions to do it, but I'm about to share my screen.
I think the third-party IA audits are going to be interesting because what ethical duty does that third-party audit have? Who are they bound by? Are they worried about being deselected from that carrier for doing a good job?
This is a policy. You mentioned, and let me kill his comment real quick. You mentioned the faulty, inadequate, defective maintenance or something along those lines. I've had long conversations with adjusters from different carriers today, specifically about this issue and wear and tear. So here is your exclusion. We do not insure for loss to property described in coverages A and B. For faulty, inadequate, defective, there's maintenance right there. Hopefully you guys can see my mouse on your end. But then there's this part at the very beginning in this paragraph. It says, however, any ensuing loss to property described in A and B, not excluded by any other provision in this policy is covered. If the faulty, inadequate, or defective maintenance leads to damage that is otherwise covered, if it results in damage that is otherwise covered, a pipe burst, faulty, inadequate, defective maintenance could be wind-driven rain because they didn't repair a roof that was already a hole. They didn't maintain it properly. But now there's more damages coming in. Are those damages excluded by the policy? If they aren't, then it's an ensuing loss that is still covered. And I feel like, and I can tell you this, my impression is they don't want the IA firms or the TPA firms to use the word damage. Because if they say that it's damage caused by wind, then they cannot go back and say inadequate maintenance or wear and tear, which often has the same ensuing loss provision tied to it. And if they can't say wear and tear, improper installation, then they can't just deny the claim and hope you don't see this ensuing loss provision. I have taught so many PAs about ensuing loss provisions over the years and so many contractors, and I know it's complex. I know it's confusing. I know it is. All right. I understand it's a complex issue, but contractors need to know, policyholders need to know about ensuing losses because this is where you're getting screwed. I'll show you the wear and tear portion of this just before I get out of here.
There was a TPA claim that I worked with, and I thought for sure this water claim, when I was early on, I thought for sure this water claim was going to be denied. There's all sorts of stuff going on with it. And the desk adjuster was phenomenal. They went back in and really dug into the coverage and said, we can absolutely get this covered.
That's great.
Great. Yeah.
Why do they stop it? So I have been dealing with so many policies with engineer reports where they say it's wear and tear in the conclusions. They don't say anything about the wear and tear leading to hail in the conclusion, but in the body of the engineer report, they'll say that because the shingles were older, it allowed smaller than expected hail to cause damage to it. So hail damage results from wear and tear. The age of the roof allowed this smaller hail to cause damage. Here is the exclusion. We do not insure, however, for loss caused by any of the following: wear and tear, marring, deterioration. If you get a denial letter that stops there and doesn't have this next part in it, there might be fraud involved, and I'd like you to send it to me with the policyholder's permission. There's some exceptions to C6 that involve pipe bursts. I can keep going, though. Under 2B and C above, that was 2C6. So that's 2C. Under 2B and C above, any ensuing loss to property described in coverages A and B not excluded by any of the provisions property is covered. If they don't put this part in that denial letter along with it, then they might be hiding coverages.
Fair enough. Yeah.
And if the engineer's report says that it's because it's old that hail damage occurred, but they don't put that in the conclusions, they might be omitting some information. Both of those put together might be exactly the strategy used to deny coverages as a whole. If you see this going on, please reach out to me. My email address is Matthew, spelled with one T, at listentothisbull.com. Get permission from the policyholder. Send me that stuff, please. All right, I'm going to get off my soapbox now. We'll go to something else. If I can figure out where my mouse is. There it is. That was weird. I could see my mouse on that screen, but it was really on this screen because it was shared. It was trippy. It's trippy. Anyway. All right. Inception mouse. When adjusting a hail claim, you're generally looking for some accompanying wind reports in addition to your hail report. This is from Christian Barrientos. Did I say that right? Barrientos? Is it Spanish?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Double L. Roll the R's. Double L's.
Adam does better at this than I do. I really want to learn Spanish. Anyway, I'm working through my SPPA Institute designation and read about the relationship between wind speed and impact angle of the hail with respect to the severity of damage. You know what? It's hard to find wind reports. The wind data is wildly inaccurate because they don't have anemometers on site. They're miles away at airports, 30 feet above ground level. And if you know anything about wind, anytime it changes direction around something, there's something called the Bernoulli effect that takes place. There's also a lot of vortices and things. There are a lot of rules of thumb that are used for wind that really make no sense because the roofs are not simple up and over or four-sided hips. So when you're looking at hail claims, you could try to get wind reports to see the general wind speed of the area, but it also won't pick up major wind gusts. It's also not going to give you any downward moving air or upward moving air. It can only track what is coming closer to or further away from the radar point that is tracking it in the air. And that's at altitude anyway, not at ground level. So the reality is you're not going to get that data unless the policyholder happens to have a weather station at their house that you can pull some data from. But it would be great because all of the information that we're given from engineering firms is related to terminal velocity of hail based on the size of a sphere that's fully solid ice. And that terminal velocity oftentimes makes a lot of assumptions, like the thickness of the air. Some of those reports, or some of those different algorithms that they use make the thickness of the air, the thickness of air at sea level. Adam, how much air is above sea level? Fucking all of it.
Yeah.
All of it is above sea level. All right. So why would you do the thickness of air at sea level? That doesn't really make sense to me. So it's going to fall faster if it's going through thinner air. So places like Colorado are going to have faster falling hail than places like Florida. All right. So it's going to be area specific, but they don't do that. They do all these rule of thumb with these assumptions that are made, and it's terrible. You need to act like a detective. I needed to actually make sure it makes sense. There are ways of measuring the size of the hail, and there are ways of measuring the impact damage, but they're not the ways that they've been teaching you. And that's unfortunate. One of the first things I learned about while having a hail gun is that the hail damage doesn't look the same when you hit different parts of a roof. Most of those tests that are done in laboratory, they only hit the center of a shingle or the center of an upper laminate tab, and they avoid the rafters, and they avoid the perimeter of those shingles. Why do they do that? Why can't we see what it looks like when hail hits a shingle that's sitting on top of a rafter and has no place to deflect?
Screw that. Let's do it.
Same impact mark as in between rafters where it will bounce a little bit? No, it's going to be different. So we can't make some expectations on what it's going to look like without having that kind of information done in laboratory tests, but also in the field. My gun is going to make a big difference. State Farm gives 2 years to repair the roof. 18 months later, the shingle is no longer available. Does State Farm now owe to replace the roof? Ooh, good question.
Very good question.
Oh, wow. That's a good question. I can see, okay, so they owe ACV at time of loss, right? An ACV would be based on the RCV at the time of loss, whatever that means. According to Merlin, that means during the loss producing event, and you might have to actually say that the RCV is how much it would cost to actually hire someone to get someone out within the next 10 minutes with all the materials. So maybe it would be an astronomical cost, but let's just say it's, if there wasn't a loss happening on that day, the day of the occurrence, what the cost would be normally, RCV minus depreciation would be ACV at the time of loss. But if you have 2 years to repair the roof and claim your RCV benefits, then realistically, you have the ability to wait up until that 2 year mark to have the repairs done and only claim your ACV benefits up to that point. And if you then go to do that and they are discontinued and you can no longer provide the shingles, I can see why it would cost more. Does State Farm owe to replace it? You know, unless they have something specifically in their policy about the RCV for materials available at the time of loss or something along those lines, it's reasonable and it's necessary and you're within their time frame.
I would say that as long as you're within the time frame to do it, and you can prove the shingles are discontinued,
They
that's when
absolutely will fight you on this.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Expect a fight. But I would
Yeah.
say that you're going to want to submit all of your documentation for what the closest match is. If they're doing an ITEL or an NTS report, I recommend NTS. But
I also recommend in this situation, and it shouldn't matter. It shouldn't, but it will. Come find out why they waited that long, and hopefully there's a super reasonable explanation on why they waited 2 years to make the repairs.
Yeah. That's going to be a big part of it. What the reason was, because they have 2 years to repair the roof. As if they're in that time frame, and the reasoning is like, well, we were just waiting until the shingles were discontinued. It's not we were hoping on a better storm to get the roof replaced. I've seen that on the IA side too. So
you'd have to look at the specific policy language. I know there are policies that specify that they'll pay the RCV benefits at the time of loss as well. So if State Farm policy says that, there has been recent case in Florida where that has deemed to mean at the time of loss and not when they make the repair. So if it says that specifically, they might actually hold you to that in your state as well. And also be careful. There are some states that State Farm gives you 2 years to make repairs, but you only have 1 year suit limitation period anyway. So you have up to 1 year from the date of loss to file suit if they act inappropriately, but you have 2 years to collect your RCV benefits. It really doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah. I think the problem you'll run into is that not only do you have 2 years to repair the roof, but you're going to run into a provision where you've got 180 days or so to inform them that you want to reclaim your RCV benefits. And if you haven't done that, and you're coming up on 2 years, you're going to be stuck at ACV regardless of what you do, because that's in the policy provision, right? So that's
now there are some policies, to go on what you just said, there are some policies that state you have to notify us within a certain period of time that you intend to make repairs, or you may claim ACV benefits instead of RCV benefits. And in the event that you do so, then you have 180 days to make repairs to then claim your RCV benefits. Well, if you never specifically address the fact that you were claiming ACV only and you don't intend to make repairs and you're only going to claim ACV, then you didn't just claim ACV. That's just all that they've given you. If you claim RCV benefits from the beginning saying, I want to file a claim, that means RCV benefits automatically unless you specify ACV. So you might be able to bypass those kinds of clauses. I have bypassed those clauses in the past. With the same issue.
The same advice that I think everybody should have, and it's IAPA, whatever. Read the fucking policy. Like, if you find that provision, that should go with your proof of loss. Like that note should go in your initial statement.
And after you read that policy, then go into your CRM and put notes about that policy in it. So the next time you have that policy, you can just look at your notes and you won't have to go looking for that again.
Amazing how that works.
That shit, so you don't duplicate efforts. Chris Thorne asks, how would you handle a policy issued and a premium paid as RCV coverage per the declarations page, and after a successful appraisal, coverage adjusted to reflect RPS?
Yes.
Premiums paid as RCV. Well, that's the thing. So if the policy has changed to have RPS in it, or even if you purchased it with that, in some states, to have this, it might not be strictly legal, but in some states, they've been having this for a long time. Most likely that policy that's being sold with that in there has been approved by the Department of Insurance. And if it has been approved for sale in that state, then, it's not a surplus lines or something like that, which doesn't get approved. These are approved by the state. And if you purchased it that way, then that's what you've got. If you want to have a fight about it, that no one ever told me about this, that's an error and omissions kind of a deal with the agent, potentially. It's their liability insurance on the line. In some states, you might have to sign off that you have that, or initial part of it. If they're adding that onto your policy at a renewal, then if they didn't give you sufficient notice for that change for you to make some kind of a comment to say you don't want that, then you could also go back to the agent or potentially the insurance carrier with a liability concern and go against their errors and omissions. It's not a good fight, and PA should not get involved in that because that's a third-party case, third-party claim against that agent you're not involved in.
Yeah.
All right. This will sound silly, but is it? Another Stephen Hadhazi. I'm almost nervous to read this one because if we're going to talk about gays and females again,
Nope, we're
my
talking
show
about
might just get canceled. The appraisal clauses do not specify that an appraiser has to be human.
incorrect. Like, I mean, I get where he's going. He's wanting to see whether or not a definitive AI appraiser be legal. That's going to get.
Would a definitive AI appraiser be legal within the current language of the appraisal clauses? Here is one from an HO3. If you only fail to agree on the amount of loss, either may demand an appraisal of the loss, and the event each party will choose a competent and impartial appraiser within 20 days of receiving a written request from the other. Interesting.
Your states, I'm going to jump in. Your states are going to determine who's able to be an appraiser, right? In Louisiana, in no way can you have an AI be an appraiser or an umpire. Like, it doesn't take a lot in Louisiana. You just have to be 21, have a pulse, and $55, at least in the past. But they're
Or
starting
that
to change.
bill that they were trying to pass.
That's a mess.
No one can be an appraiser, basically. So
Not more than once.
yeah, not more than once. Exactly. With each carrier, potentially, but there was a potential conflict of interest listed for every possible potential conflict there could ever be, which would potentially get you written off as it. It wouldn't work. It was too strict. But yeah, I highly doubt an AI, at least in its current state, would be able to show up on site to investigate a loss.
Correct.
So I think an appraiser, not defined in policies, but if it ever was defined, it would probably need to start saying things like a natural person, use that kind of language that they use for corporations and for a lot of the legal jargon for consumer protections. Consumer is a natural person. I bet they might have to start adding that language in. It's not, it isn't as ridiculous as it sounded, Stephen, but it was damn ridiculous. We have 3 different carriers that are utilizing these third-party reviews of the IA scopes on our files here in Florida. Third-party reviews. I misinterpreted what he asked earlier. Let me scroll back up. Third-party audits of IA estimates. Were you talking about that earlier, Adam?
Mm-hmm.
So TPA firm, completely separate third-party auditing company outside of the IA firm is auditing this IA's files, which is already a third party to the carrier. So we're a fourth party in
Correct.
For the review of this. But the carrier's hiring this audit as well. So it's 2 third parties. One is auditing the other.
So when they've got, I'll break it down, right? The insurance company has hired the TPA. The TPA has then sent out their IA, right? So they're sending out their IA. Carrier hires the TPA. TPA sends out their IA. And then the carrier goes back and gets another third party to basically audit what the TPA is doing, or to audit what the IA is doing, on top of the fact that they've already got a desk adjuster and quality control with most TPA firms. Or the TPA firm might be hiring another third party to audit their IAs internally, but that should be somebody in-house.
I mean, if this is not a TPA firm, then there might not be any regulations on them. TPA firms do have regulations in most states. If this is a third party auditing company and they're making changes to the IA scopes, or are they asking the IA to make changes to their scopes? I think that's a very important distinction, because if they're the ones that are making changes and they're not registered as a TPA firm, there might actually be some illegal action there.
That's the thing. Are they an actual licensed entity? Are they a licensed adjuster, or are they, where are they fitting into this, and where does their responsibility go? Where does the liability go with that? I'm not pleased with it at all. I think that TPA companies and the IAs should be able to do what they need to do to get them done properly without having to go to a third party audit of their own people. Handle that internally. Hire people better, train them better, do your job. It's not.
So Todd was mentioning the wear and tear, improper installation stuff that I was showing earlier. He believes it's insurance fraud. I'll be honest, I believe it is too. And anyway, could use some more examples, guys. Have you ever, Stephen, again, have you ever left a shingle sample on a hot roof and then taken it down and hit it with a gun? I did back in 2014. It is quite a different looking impact. The asphalt is super soft. No, I have not. And here's why. I thought about doing this. But most hailstorms come as a thunderstorm. Thunderstorms come on the tail of a cold front. And there's usually wind that hits the area maybe 50, well in advance of the hail landing. So the shingles have an opportunity to cool to a certain extent. There's also rain involved a lot of times, although the larger hail will fall before rain, so it doesn't cool off completely, but it will cool to a certain extent. I haven't done that. I understand why you did that. And it will make a difference, but there's too many variables, and we have to limit the amount of variables that we use when doing some kind of an experiment to show that there's any kind of results. We try to make as much control as possible. And one of the controls that we can set is the temperature in the lab. So a lot of the ASTM testings and UL type testing for asphalt shingles specifies a specific temperature in the lab or a temperature range. And it's not the same temperature that's on a roof. I definitely understand where you're going with that, though. When I am able to take my gun onto roofs, I'm not going to be able to control that. And it's not going to be at a time when wind comes through. So it's one of those variables that I'm actually having a hard time with when talking about taking my gun out to fire a hailstone at the same roof that they're claiming is wear and tear instead of hail, and seeing if it causes the same damage. I'm not going to be able to simulate the same weather conditions that occurred at the same date. So it's going to be cooler, most likely, than the temperature that I'm on the roof for. And we're not going to know what that temperature is at that time, most likely. So it is something I'm thinking about quite a bit. I don't know how to overcome that. If you come up with any ideas on that, I'd love to know. I believe State Farm dropped that 2-year to just 1. Possibly. It depends on the state. State Farm has different policies per state, guys. So the suit limitation period being 1 year is only on specific states that allow that kind of a thing. In Georgia, it's 1 year on all perils except for fire and lightning, for example, because that's the way that state works. In other states, they have 3 years suit limitation period. So these are state specific things. Brandon Ford, if they went disco, someone's got those shingles a few months later, more than likely, I would think. True. It is a good point. And they might even still be at a supply house. So if we just adapt that question to say that the shingles are no longer available from any source at that time, what happens? Because sometimes there are a run on certain materials. Let's see if I can find an actual question that's unrelated because I'm behind on these. What would be a valid proof of burden by the carrier to deny additional coverage to a roof after viewing a video providing proof the roof was not repairable? What they use now is engineers. And the engineers who probably aren't competent to make the statement say that it is pliable and therefore repairable. But then if you go to certain engineer firm websites, they'll claim that there is no such thing as a brittle test and you cannot make any real determination based on that. And the only real way to identify whether or not a shingle is repairable is to actually attempt repairs. And then you have the National Academy of Forensic Engineers repairability assessment guide, which BEI is creating a course out of with the same author as our instructor for that class. So there are a lot of ways to identify that the engineers could use, but they don't. They just lift a corner or something and say that it's pliable, therefore it's repairable, or that there's been repairs in the past, therefore it's repairable. Both ridiculous statements. If an engineer who has never made a repair on a roof ever themselves tells you that a roof is repairable and a qualified contractor could do it, they're full of shit and they don't actually know, and they're not competent in that statement. And if you're an engineer watching this and you're doing that, understand your competency rules still apply. That is a part of your assignment, a part of your project you probably aren't competent in. I highly recommend you go try replacing a shingle and notice that the removal of the nails is the part that causes the most damage, not the installation of nails. You jackasses. I believe in you guys. Engineers are the best. I wanted to be an engineer forever. But forensic engineers, what the hell is going on in forensic engineering? It makes no sense.
Selection.
What if they're not skeptical enough? You'd think they would be more skeptical. What if there isn't an accepted scope of loss from State Farm until 8 months after the date of loss? If roof is replaced after the 2 years from date of loss, would the full RCV be lost or just the original RCV from State Farm's first scope? So this is something that's a contention point for a lot of states. If they provide an estimate, do you have to then immediately make repairs, or can you wait until a proper scope and estimate is approved before you start making the repairs? And this becomes an argument for ALE benefits. And that's where this argument resides most of the time. But it could be applied the exact same way here. I think that it still depends on the policy and when the RCV is calculated. Is it calculated as the amount that's actually spent? Or is it calculated as the amount that's occurred at the date of loss? And for Chip Merlin, if it's at the date of loss, that's always a higher amount, because at the time of loss would be the time that the loss is occurring. How much would it cost to get someone out there right then in that moment while it's still happening? It'd be outrageous, astronomical. I love that argument. I really want to see that come to fruition. All right, we're running out of time. Let's see if I can find one more question.
No questions. I'll change course.
Todd, I'm not going to ask your questions because we're going to do that when I have you on the show.
Yeah.
Chad was just talking about this guy. He is the author of that National Academy of Forensic Engineers assessment for repairability of shingles. He is going to be doing the training at Building Experts Institute on exactly that. Probably come out in the next couple of months. Yes, Chad is one of the good ones. So if you're a forensic engineer and you don't like the statement that I made earlier, you should talk to Chad Williams with Valor Forensic Engineering. He can talk to you about that. This guy knows what he's talking about, and he'd be happy to talk to you about that. He's got all the time in the world. That guy's not busy at all. It's a complete lie. That guy is very busy. All right, this is my last statement, and then we got to cut it off. Legitimate engineers will not inspect a roof and will laugh at you when you ask. Only engineers in bed with carriers will do a roof inspection. Well, that's not exactly true, because there are engineers that are hired by policyholders, such as Chad Williams, that will still inspect the roof and might actually apply a scientific method to their investigation. It is possible to do, but the engineers that are legitimate, the way Todd is stating, they generally don't become forensic engineers. The forensic engineers that become forensic engineers usually become that because they can't get a job in their chosen profession. This isn't what they're usually doing. And typical forensic engineers are looking at failure of materials and things and how they failed, and other kinds of components related to that, or structural design failures and things when a giant building collapses or fire cause and origin investigations. So there are legitimate forensic engineers. The ones that get on roofs that are doing the causation, they aren't using the scientific method, and they totally could. It'd be so easy to take a hail hit that's old and a hail hit that's new on the same roof and do a comparison between the two for coloration differences, and actually be able to say that if this one was newer, it would be about the same color as this. They could even do a hypothesis, remove some granules from an area and see what the color is after they remove granules and compare that. They could go to areas as a control that are blocked from hail and identify if the same damages exist there. But they don't do that, do they? They just make these wild assumptions. I'm going to stop drinking this beer.
You could have been an engineer. You could have. Your life would be so much easier just to deny everything.
It would be. It would be. All right. This has been an interesting episode. Thank you for taking us down the path of talking about female roofers and gays on roofs. I hope the show exists next week after that conversation. Yeah. Cancel culture is real. All right, guys. Thanks for joining us. If you'd like to go to listentothisbull.com, I got some merchandise on there that can help the channel. We're also looking for sponsors. If you have a company and you want to get the word out on a platform that people actually trust the opinion of, because I'm not going to let just anybody sponsor this show. I'm definitely going to vet out your product. Get with me. I've got some programs set aside, ready to have some sponsors. Be one of the first sponsors of the show. That'd be fantastic. We would really appreciate it. All right. I'll see you guys next Tuesday at 6 p.m. Eastern.